Ossian Siaya, I Tanishqualan, Quitsi, Quitsnala Ihui, Antha, and Sochalot, Antha Manas and Thalia, Eatsiap Max Slahot Siam, Antha Imith Quathan Sochalot, Quatslahot Siam, Heid Setka, Meet Set, Eat Lami. So what I said to you in the very teeny tiny bit of my language called Hunkweetnam or Downriver Hokamelam that I know, I said to you, my respected friends, the feelings I have inside, or I feel really good to see you and to be with you here today. And in Coast-Salish way, I introduced myself to you with my ancestral name. I carry the name Unsalchlot. And in Coast-Salish way, I also shared with you a little bit of who my family is. And we do that for many reasons, but the most important is that it informs you, the audience, that I know who I am. I know where I come from. And now that I'm a Waututh, I know my responsibility has just become deeper. I'm a grandmother. I have, my husband and I have 5 beautiful grandchildren. And then I said, Hai Tsetka, to the Lami people for allowing us to be here today. And I'd also like to thank Northwest Indian College and the organizers for inviting us to come and share our story with you. First, I want to teach you how to say the name of my people, okay? Tsleil, Waututh. Tsleil, Waututh. Tsleil, Waututh. So Tsleil in our language means people of the Inlet, and it refers directly to, could I have the map, please? So the young fellow is going to get our map up on the screen, and I will sit down. So people of the Inlet. And so it's this inlet right here. This is the city of Vancouver. This is the Burrard Inlet. So it's all the way through English Bay, the first Narrows, the second Narrows, all the way up the Indian Arm to the Indian River. That is what Waututh means. And my reserve is just a really teeny, probably as big as this dot right there. So I think what I'll do is I'll just give you a little bit of background about who we are, and then my colleague Erin Hansen will fill you in in the more academic language about the work that we do. I want you to understand too that Waututh has a rigorous hiring process. So the people that come to work for us, the Waututh people, the non-native people that come to work for us, work with us. Our teachings, our values resonate within their souls. So the work that they do for us is truly the wishes of our ancestors that are coming through. We heard earlier this morning from the senator and the representative, how about the different language that you need to know when you're dealing, especially with governments. Like anything that you look at, there's an aspect, it has its own language. So the people that work with us can translate what our intent is, using the English language to communicate the strength, the power, and the responsibilities that Waututh people have to protect our homelands and waters. So I like to begin with our creation story. I'm not a really good storyteller like some of my cousins are, but in Coast Salish territory there's this supernatural being called Hals. And Hals travels around Coast Salish territory checking up on his people. And when he came to the inlet, he noticed there were no human beings there, but there was a family of wolves on the beach. And he took that alpha male and transformed him into our first grandfather. And our grandfather continued his life in the Inlet and noticed that he didn't have a mate, like all his brothers of the animal kingdom had a mate. He didn't have one. So the Creator sent him a vision. And his vision was to go to the highest bluff cliff in our inlet and to dive into the inlet right to the bottom and pick up 2 handfuls of sediment, which he did. He brought it to the beach, put it down and cleared a circle around these 2 handfuls of sediment. And in the morning he woke up and there was our first grandmother. So we are taught from birth that our shahalmas, our sacred obligation, is to protect our homelands and waters, not just for our use, but for the 4-legged, the winged, the swimmers. Another adage we grow up with, or a teaching that we grow up with in our language, we call it Waututh. Waututh is our teachings, our laws. When the tide went out, the table was set. I'm a teacher by trade, so when I tell children that, I ask them, so what do you think that means? And even the littlest kid in kindergarten, he knows exactly what that means. So that again is our shahalmas, that's our obligation to protect that inlet. Because our first grandmother comes from that inlet. So what I do as my job for the nation, I'm called a special projects manager, and it's basically an intergovernmental relations kind of job. I sit on a committee called the Indigenous Advisory and Monitoring Committee for the Trans Mountain Pipeline Project expansion. And so this committee focuses on the monitoring and the advisory aspects of the current pipeline and the potential pipeline they want to build. And through the work that Tsleil has done, Erin will expand more on how we went about that, to include the marine shipping. Because you heard Representative Lakanov say this morning, the increase of vessel traffic in the Salish Sea over the next little while is just going to be horrific. So when we saw the advertisement for this symposium come up, my spirit did a happy dance. Because of the work I do, I'm speaking to government people, municipal, provincial, federal people, and I hate to use the word resources when I talk about the clams on the beach, the crab, the oysters, the deer, the elk, because they're not resources in the Wanitam way. Resources is something that you extract and you fix it up or whatever and you sell it. That's not how we as Waututh people look at that. And I mentioned it to one of my older relatives from Salmona, from Duncan. I said, Ray, I really wish I knew what the word was in our language for resources, because I hate using that word. And he says, you do. I said, oh, what is it? And he says, it's sa'aftin. And that's our word for food. And he said, in his community, what it means is all that is out there in the sea for you to enjoy. So because I can enjoy that as a human being, this reciprocity is to ensure that sa'aftin is respected. Clean water is most important. So that's why I got really excited about this, and I told Erin, we gotta go. Somehow we gotta go. So we're able to find some funding, and we're here. And just listening to, the work that we do gets really hectic, and it can get so heavy, like it's a burden. But being able to come here and listen to all the panelists, so thank you to all the panelists that came before us. it shows that we're on the right path. It's reinvigorating. We're not in this alone. We're doing it together. And that's what Waututh tries to do as well. I don't say we try, we do. We build relationships. You heard Representative Deborah talk about the Co-Salish gathering. We got together at the beginning of when we heard the Trans Mountain proposed project. And through some of the research we did, we found out, like back in the early 70s, Trans Mountain, I forget who owned it back then, wanted to double the line then. So in Canada, we go through this regulatory process set up by the National Energy Board. And Dale Anderson was the chairman of the Northwest Indian Tribes affiliation, and he tried to become an intervener, and Canada wouldn't let him. So when I brought this article to the Co-Salish gathering, because it's the Co-Salish nations across this border and the Northwest tribes here, Swinomish, Suquamish, Tsleil, and Lummi intervened they applied to be interveners, and they were successful. So what they decided to do was hold the First Nation or the Indigenous hearings separate from the general public. And before, one of our ways of practicing our laws, I'm still really trying to get used to saying that. I guess I need to find out what it means in our language. We hold ceremony. So the hearings were happening in Chilliwack in British Columbia, and we knew that our people going before this energy board, a panel of 3 Juanitan people, have no idea who we are. And yet they're going to be taking evidence, and they're going to be considering whether to, recommend the project go through or not. But before we were going to step into that room, it was important that we hold ceremony for all the speakers. In our Co-Salish way, we hire people to be speakers. They tell our story, because Co-Salish people can't talk about themselves in that sense. So we hire a speaker. The young man over here has been our speaker all day for the last 2 days. So we invited all the Indigenous folks that were going to be speaking before the panel, and we held ceremony in the Longhouse in Kokalitsa. And we worked with the Stewardship people for that to happen. The U.S. tribes weren't there the first day, so what they did was they worked with the Stewardship people also, and they held a water ceremony at the Fraser River before their people went before the board. So I guess what I'm just trying to say is it's really important to weave together and stand firm. Deborah also was saying, we have to be fierce and we have to be courageous. We are done being dictated to how things are going to go, because our salmon are in trouble, because our relatives, the Kashtelamits and the orcas, are in trouble. Luckily, we have enough allies on the other side of the table that they understand. So my challenge to them, every chance I get, is it's your turn. You have to stand up within your own systems, because you understand where we're coming from now. And we don't do this work just for us. We do it for our relatives that are across the border. We do our relatives that are in Alberta. We do it for our relatives that are on Vancouver Island. But for every other single human being that chooses to live here. Because we are a welcoming people. We know you came here for a better life. We don't want you to be barred from that or struggle with that. But that reciprocity has to be, the Indigenous peoples deserve that life as well. We survived for some reason. And it's to this point in time now where people can stand up and do the things that we do. Having gatherings like this probably wouldn't have been heard of 20 years ago, which is not even the lifetime of my oldest child. You know, so imagine that. I think I'm good. I think I shared what I needed to share. So I'm going to pass it over to Erin, and she'll talk more about us.
Great, thank you so much. I also would like to acknowledge the Lummi Nation and thank them for hosting us and bringing us all together today and yesterday. It's such an honor to be here with you all, and I'm really appreciative for the discussions that have been happening with the speakers at the front here, but also amongst all the attendees. It's been really illuminating and re-energizing to just be able to speak with you all and share ideas and discuss a lot of what we find we often have in common. Just continuing off of, I suppose I should introduce myself first. My name is Erin Hansen. I work for the Waututh Nation. I work as a policy advisor. I'm also currently managing the Sacred Trust Initiative at Waututh, and I work in the Treaty Lands and Resources Department. I myself am non-Indigenous, so I tend to introduce myself as a settler Canadian of European descent, and I grew up along the banks of the Fraser River in Vancouver, in Richmond. So I'll just, to contextualize some of the things I'd like to speak about, I'll just continue to point to this map here. The Treaty Lands and Resources Department that I work in is one of 5 departments that make up the Tsleil Nation government. And what we are responsible for are all the lands and waters within the territory that are off reserve. So in Canada, it's a little different from the United States. A lot of the reserves are quite small compared to the reservations in the United States. And I hope this mic won't reach. So you see this boundary. It's okay. So this black line, thank you. This black line around the territory is what we call our consultation boundary. And where it came from was in 1998 to 2000, there was a traditional use and occupancy study that was conducted with the community. And so Tsleil-Waututh elders and community members mapped the places that they themselves have individually used the land. So I tend to describe this as a snapshot in time. It only represents living members within a 2-year period of areas that they have been using the land, where they've been hunting and fishing, harvesting, practicing ceremony. So all these dots on the map over this 2-year period were collectively covered the area that is now encompassed within this black line here. And it goes up a little bit further to sort of the Sea to Sky corridor in the north. And it comes all the way down across the Metro Vancouver region down to the US border here. So hopefully that situates you a little bit. And as Carleen had pointed out, the Tsleil-Waututh Reservation is just here in North Vancouver. But you can see this is Vancouver, and so there's quite a lot going on in the territory. So in Canada, Aboriginal rights are constitutionally protected, and what that means is that means that legally Crown governments, so provinces and the federal government, have a legal obligation to consult with First Nations when they're proposing certain decisions or development projects that might impact those Aboriginal rights and title. And so I really appreciate the previous panel and that discussion about consultation and consent, and I'm sort of building off of that because the work that I've been doing at Waututh since about 2012 has been managing consultation processes over development projects in the territory. And we have a whole team, a very multidisciplinary team that works together to determine how these different development proposals might impact Waututh. How might it impact the land base? What are the environmental effects? How might it impact archaeology and cultural heritage? How might it impact uses of the land ceremonially, spiritually? So we have a team of, like I mentioned, archaeologists, environmental scientists, cultural knowledge holders, and we all work together to understand these impacts and then respond to the different levels of government or to proponents to inform them. And how can these projects be changed or be made better so that we can actually leave the territory in a better condition than it has been? So because because of the territory and the location, there's a lot happening, as I said, and so we get about 400 to 500 new consultation requests per year. So that's in addition to all the multi-year regulatory processes that we might be continuing on. So certain things are subjected to environmental assessment reviews, some things are smaller scale, but we get such a range of projects from forestry to mining to highway realignments, and really small things like ditch realignments, for example. And of course, there might be a pipeline in the territory that's, you know, a big one that we're considering, that we're looking at, that we're reviewing. And so, in response to all of these development proposals, Tsleil-Waututh, I'll give you a little bit of history here. In Canadian law in 2004, that was when the Supreme Court determined that there was a legal requirement to consult. And that would be a way in which we could ensure that Aboriginal rights are sufficiently protected. But they didn't provide any guidance on how First Nations would be able to respond to that. So you have the big machinery of government and all of these different proponents and all of these different interest groups that all of a sudden need to consult with small First Nations individually. And so all of a sudden, Tsleil-Waututh, among other First Nations, were subjected to this onslaught of consultation requests. You know, lots of technical information, very specialized information that was all coming to these nations. And we had to find ways to engage. And again, in the discussion previous, just before lunch, there was a mention about how there's ramifications if you don't come to the table. One of them, of course, being that then if you don't have a seat at the table, how will you influence what happens in your territory? So in response to this situation, Tsleil-Waututh developed what we call our Stewardship Policy. And that was a way that the nation could set out for itself what meaningful consultation meant. Again, the Supreme Court of Canada described that governments had to consult, but what did meaningful consultation look like? That was still an outstanding question. And so Tsleil-Waututh defined that for themselves, and the Stewardship Policy sets out what does a meaningful process look like. So for example, there's requirements such as we need sufficient information to be able to adequately understand the project that's being proposed. We need sufficient time to review all this information and sufficient time to have a dialogue. We also need a commitment that we will have that dialogue, and if there are outstanding issues, there is an opportunity to resolve them before a decision is made. So procedurally, Tsleil-Waututh set out what meaningful consultation meant, but then we also, of course, have standards on what an acceptable project looks like to the nation. So we ask questions in accordance with two lenses, and that first lens is it a good land use decision? What impacts does this development have on the territory and on Tsleil-Waututh people? And if we find that that there's not any negative impacts, then we move on to the second lens, which is are the benefits to the nation commensurate with the impacts that there may be. And so Tsleil-Waututh is not anti-development at all. Tsleil-Waututh has a really robust economic development department and a range of businesses in the territory. And so Tsleil-Waututh is not anti-development, but we are pro-sustainable development. And so what we try to do in the Lands and Resources Department is not just review these projects, but then get creative. We can have fun with this. Let's get creative in finding ways that we can make projects better. So for example, if there's there was a bridge that was being dismantled, for example, and we found that it might have impacts to salmon habitat, to sturgeon habitat. So we were proposing, hey, why don't we build into this some fish habitat components so we can actually strengthen the ecosystem and leave it better than where we left it. So I've been doing this work since I mentioned since 2012, and then in about 2015 I decided to go back to school, and I wanted to look at this in sort of a more academic light, because even though we were participating so fully in consultation processes and we were having these amazing discussions with different levels of government, we were building really, really strong relationships, yet we were finding that despite that, there was something in the consultation process that still limited our ability to influence these decisions. And again, I recognize that there's been some conversation already at this conference. And this morning, the senator mentioned, there's a caucus room that people would go into, and then they'd come out and they'd have changed their mind, and you'd think, what happens in that caucus room? And I feel like there's, I was thinking to myself, what are the different caucus rooms in the work that I do in which we have these amazing discussions and we present really robust science. We have science that's what we describe as, Western and Indigenous science. We have all of these amazing, compelling studies that we might, and pieces of information that we might provide. So why do we find that Tsleil-Waututh's access to their land base, to their resources, the ability to bring back the health of the inlet, why are we finding that still gets compromised despite these amazing processes that we've developed and these conversations we're having? So I went back to school and was the question that I was asking was, I was looking at the consultation process as a site of legal orders and different legal systems meeting. How might we think about the consultation table as a site of legal interactions where Coast Salish law comes into dialogue with Canadian law? And Canadian law says we have to consult, and Canadian law has regulatory processes that set up the standards by which these projects are being assessed. But Tsleil-Waututh has taught me that Coast Salish law and Tsleil-Waututh law has standards that say we cannot harm the resources, we cannot harm our relatives. And as Carleen was saying, when we frame these as resources to exploit, what does that mean when we consider a lot of these non-human beings in the territory our relatives? What are our responsibilities and our obligations to those? So I had been thinking about that as a place where Tsleil-Waututh has an opportunity to present the nation's laws and legal orders, and Canada can come and speak to its interests and its laws and its legal orders. But of course, we can't disregard the fact that we are operating within a colonial legal system that dominates. So the Canadian legal system, through the consultation process, says consultation needs to happen so that we recognize Indigenous rights and we protect those rights. And we do not infringe upon those rights, although legally they can justify infringement and then go ahead, but we'll save that for another conversation. And I started to think about how distilling these dynamics into this conversation about rights, it constrains a lot of what we are really trying to do here. It's important to assert those rights, and it's important to recognize those rights and protect those rights. But I think that in the Canadian imagination, in sort of legal imagination, when we bring it down just to rights, the way that, and I'm not a lawyer, so I have to put that disclaimer out there, but my non-lawyer experience of engaging in a lot of these conversations, it's the fact that these rights are constitutionally protected that bring people to the table. So they're there because they know that they need to recognize those rights, and when they understand those rights as you have a right to fish, but that's kind of that. What that ends up doing is it ends up flattening this whole dynamic system, this whole multifaceted system of, I'm tempted to say resource management, but I know that's also a constraining term that we use. So I realized that, I wanted to move beyond this idea of legal orders meeting at the consultation tables, because what I saw was happening was that when we come into dialogue, Tsleil-Waututh is asserting their laws and their jurisdiction and saying, this is what we expect, this is what we need, and this is what we're going to do. In some of those conversations we've had with other levels of government, we've articulated the nation's priorities of restoring the health of the inlet. So as Carleen mentioned, Tsleil-Waututh means people of the inlet. And the first grandmother was from the sediment of the inlet. In 2005, the community worked with Chief and Council and developed what they call their marine stewardship goals. And so the community has essentially mandated us to move forward on these goals. And those goals include restoring the health of the inlet so the community can once again harvest healthy wild marine food. And another one of those goals is having clean and safe waters so that the community can practice ceremony or engage in different cultural activities in those waters. And so we articulate that. And we share with other levels of government that this is the work that we need to do. And I think as a non-Indigenous person who's grown up in the Greater Vancouver region, I think it's pretty safe to say that a lot of us who aren't Salish look out at Burrard Inlet or look out at Vancouver and we see a big bustling city, we see an industrialized port, we see urbanized and industrialized shorelines, and we think, oh, this is Vancouver, this is how it is, this is the status quo, this is where we're at. And what I love about the way that Tsleil-Waututh asserts their laws and their obligations is that folks will tell you that it may have taken us 150 years to get to where things are right now. And it might take us another 150 to get it back, to get the water clean again, to bring the herring back, to bring the salmon back. And that's okay, because that's the work we need to do. We're not saying Vancouver needs to go away, we're not saying that at all, but we are saying that we can improve the conditions here, and we can work together to bring back the health of the inlet. And I think sometimes we get responses to those points we make, and folks say, well, that's a nice idea, well, that's really great. And I mean, you can kind of read between the lines, but I sort of interpret it as some people respond with like, that's really lovely and aspirational, good luck with that. But I want to share a story, and again, I think it works well with the theme of this conference. So we've been doing different activities like water quality monitoring, fisheries habitat restoration, again, working with all these development projects to try to reduce their impacts to the land base and the waters. And we know that we're on that path. And if other levels of government recognize that or not, great. If they recognize it, they can join us. But whether or not they recognize it, we're doing it anyway. Tsleil-Waututh is doing it anyway. And so the story that I want to share is about the whales returning to the inlet. The killer whale is, I know it's important to so many nations and Salish nations, and the whale is very important to Tsleil-Waututh. And there are stories of whales in Burrard Inlet returning at important moments for the community. I won't get into these stories because I know I'll have to wrap up pretty soon anyway, and I don't know that it's entirely my place to share them, but whales return to the inlet at very important moments for the community, such as upon the passing of important leaders. And these aren't far off, like long ago stories. People will share that when the late Patty George passed away, whales came into the inlet in 1994. And so killer whales haven't been in Burrard Inlet past the Second Narrows, which is where Tsleil-Waututh was located, where the reserve is located. And then you have to go past Second Narrows to get up to Indian Arm. Killer whales have not been in that inlet up that far since about 1994. And we're working so hard to try to restore the health of the water, but again, you feel like you're kind of met with this bit of skepticism that it's even possible, and we just keep trying to do what we can. And the Trans Mountain Pipeline, of course, is a project that Carleen mentioned and that many of you are familiar with, and I know that the tribes that have stood alongside us and we've worked together in mutual support to fight this project that would be very damaging to the lands and waters. There's a number of meetings that we've been having to try to convey these impacts and to try to let them know the impacts that this project would have on Tsleil-Waututh. And what we've done is with each meeting, we've had a different theme, a different topic to cover. And one day we were meeting about the killer whales and the devastating impacts that this project would have on the killer whales. And I remember feeling a lot of pressure. I thought, this is crazy. We have one day, a meeting one day to convey and to try to talk and discuss the impacts that this project would have on the whales. Oh my goodness. So we have this meeting. We're sitting in the Elders Lounge on the Waututh Reserve on the banks of Burrard Inlet. And partway through our meeting, one of my colleagues gets a text message. The whales are in the inlet. The whales are swimming past you right now. And we are all sitting there, sitting across from different levels of government, sitting across from all of these government representatives. And we had just been sharing about how we had environmental scientists talking about the biophysical impacts of the whales. And then we had cultural knowledge holders sharing about the reciprocal obligations and relationships that Tsleil has with the whales, that they are ancestors visiting, that they are sharing messages, that communication occurs in reciprocity with the whales. And when we got that message that the whales were swimming past, we all kind of stopped. And we shared that with the folks across the table. And that day we had some of them reduced to tears. Because they were very, affected, I think, by it. I think for me, it made me wonder, what does that tell us about relationality and reciprocity and how that factors into Salish laws and legal systems? And how does that illustrate to the decision makers on the part of government or on the non-Indigenous proponents and levels of government? How does that illustrate to them new ways of understanding laws that are rooted in that relationality and reminding us of the obligations that we have? How does that expand out the ways that we scope down in Canadian law, and I believe American law as well, how we scope down when we talk about what impacts to Indigenous groups would be, when we think about it in terms of just distilling rights into these little points? I think that it really opened people's minds to that expansiveness and the limitations in the colonial legal systems, in how we understand this and how we can imagine what does that intergovernmental dialogue look like? What do our legal systems, when they come into dialogue, look like? What are our obligations when we're facing such an onslaught of development projects within our territories? I think I'll have to wrap up because I think I've gone on for a while, but there's so much more that I wanted to share, but I think that really conveys it. There's other stories of successes that Waututh has been doing, and again in partnership with others. And I know that other nations have similar stories as well. Some of the things that had really stuck with me. Carleen and her family had shared with me how going down onto the beach when the tide was out, the table was set, as Carleen mentioned earlier, and growing up, harvesting all that shellfish and the clams and the crabs, and how in 1972 the pollution became so great that those shellfish beds had to close. And so I have friends that have never been able to bring their children down to the beach to harvest. And how that severs that cultural transmission, the knowledge sharing and the opportunities to gather. But what's really exciting is, again, we're taking what is frequently viewed as an industrialized inlet and we're restoring the health of it. So in 2017, Tsleil found a small but clean part of a beach up in their territory and restored the clam beds. And in 2017, the nation was able to have their first clam harvest again in a generation. So I just want to leave you with these stories because, again, I think initially my focus had been on how does the consultation process, how can we use that, and how does that help us do what we need to do? And then I realized that there's so much work that the nations are doing and that Waututh is doing that demonstrates that Salish law is active and it's vital and it is relevant and it is being applied, whether other levels of government recognize that or not. So I think I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.